Evelyn Monroe never once looked twice at the man who mopped the floors of her glass tower every night. To her, Carter Hayes was just a quiet single father in a faded uniform, the kind of man people stepped around without ever truly seeing. But on the night her enemies cut the power, sealed the elevators, and stormed the 42nd floor conference room, that same quiet man stopped walking like a janitor. 15 seconds later, Evelyn realized, heart pounding and hands trembling against the cold table, that she had unknowingly hired a battlefield legend hiding from his own buried past. If hidden military secrets and sudden dangerous twists pull you right in, stay with this story until the very end. The tower belonging to Monroe Dynamics rose above the city like a blade of glass, glowing long after every office worker had gone home, and it was in those hollow hours that Carter Hayes did his work. He pushed a heavy cart down the 42nd floor hallway each night, moving with the kind of quiet, contained discipline that nobody in that building ever bothered to notice. Employees walked past him the way they walked past the potted plants near the elevators, their eyes sliding over him without registering his presence at all. Carter had grown used to that particular kind of invisibility, and most nights he preferred it because invisibility meant safety, and safety meant no one asked questions about where a man like him had come from. He moved methodically from one wing of the floor to the next, mop in hand, but his eyes never stopped working even when his face stayed blank and unreadable. He clocked every camera angle without meaning to, counted exits the way other men counted minutes until quitting time, and noted which doors stuck and which ones opened too easily for a building that called itself secure. It was a habit so deeply wired into him that he barely registered doing it anymore, an old reflex from another life that refused to fully die no matter how many floors he mopped. That particular night, the air on the executive floor felt different, charged in a way Carter could not yet explain, though he trusted that feeling more than he trusted most people. Down the hall, a door opened sharply, and Evelyn Monroe stepped out of a conference room, looking like a woman who had spent the entire evening absorbing blows she refused to let anyone see land. She was 34 years old and ran one of the most closely watched technology and healthcare companies in the country. Yet at that moment she looked simply exhausted, her shoulders set in the careful, controlled posture of someone determined not to show weakness in her own hallway. Her assistant trailed a few steps behind her, talking quickly about tomorrow's schedule, while Evelyn nodded without truly listening, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely. A folder slipped from beneath her arm and spilled across the polished floor, papers fanning out in every direction, and for one brief moment she simply stared at the mess as though it were one more problem she did not have the energy to solve. Carter was already moving before he consciously decided to, crouching down and gathering the scattered pages with quick, careful hands. He held them out to her without a word, his expression unreadable, the same calm mask he wore for every shift. The assistant glanced at him the way people glanced at furniture, muttering a clipped thanks on Evelyn's behalf before ushering her toward the elevator, clearly eager to keep their important evening on schedule. Evelyn managed a brief, automatic word of gratitude, her eyes flicking toward Carter for less than a second, not long enough to actually see him, not long enough to notice the faint scar along his jaw or the way his stance never quite relaxed even when he stood still. She turned and walked away, already dialing back into the conversation about contracts and votes, completely unaware that the man behind her had just done something far more significant than picking up dropped paper. As Carter rose and pushed his cart toward the emergency stairwell door at the end of the hall, his gaze caught on something small near the frame, a tiny scuff mark and a faint chalk symbol low against the metal, the kind of mark left behind by someone mapping exits rather than cleaning them. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone without training, but Carter recognized it instantly, the way a man recognizes a wound he has seen before on someone else's body. Someone had been studying this building quietly and carefully long before tonight, and they had not been doing it as an employee or a guest. Carter stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the building around him, and felt the old dormant instinct in his chest stir awake for the first time in years. He told himself, as he often did in moments like this, that it meant nothing, that buildings this large attracted strange behavior all the time, deliveries mismarked, contractors careless with their tools, security teams sloppy about resetting equipment after maintenance work. He repeated that explanation to himself twice, the way a man repeats a lie he badly wants to believe, and still he found himself glancing back at the mark one final time before continuing down the hallway. The building settled into its familiar nighttime stillness around him, elevators humming faintly in their shafts, The distant whir of an air handler somewhere above the ceiling tiles sounds so ordinary that most people never notice them at all. Carter noticed everything, cataloging each sound out of habit rather than necessity, filing it away in the same quiet, methodical part of his mind that had once kept entire teams alive in far more dangerous places than this gleaming tower of glass and steel. Carter had not always been a man who disappeared into hallways and hid behind a mop. There had been a different version of him once, a man who moved through the world with a different kind of purpose, trained for years inside the Navy's most demanding units until his name became something other operators spoke with quiet respect. He had been known in those circles for his ability to clear tight, dangerous spaces and bring hostages home alive, a specialty that required equal parts patience and violence, calculation and instinct. That version of Carter had been confident, sharp, and certain of his place in the world, a man who believed completely in the mission and in the brothers who stood beside him in the dark. All of that had ended on a night he rarely allowed himself to remember in detail, a mission that went wrong in ways no amount of training could have prevented. Men he had trained beside, men whose families he had eaten dinner with, did not come home, and Carter had carried the weight of that night out of the service with him the way other men carried physical scars. He did not blame the system, and he rarely blamed bad luck, because in the quiet, brutal honesty of his own mind, he blamed himself, certain that a different decision in a different second might have changed everything. When he finally left the service, he wanted nothing to do with attention, recognition, or responsibility for anyone else's safety ever again. A job mopping floors in an office tower seemed almost like a mercy, a place where nobody expected him to be brave, where nobody needed him to be anything other than quiet and reliable. No one in that building asked about his past, and that suited him perfectly because the only thing he wanted to protect now was the small, ordinary life he was rebuilding for himself and the one person who depended on him completely. He kept no photographs on the walls of his apartment, no medals in a drawer, nothing that might invite questions, except for a single worn photograph he carried folded in his wallet, a quiet reminder of why he came to work every single night without complaint. He never spoke of it to coworkers, never let it slip during small talk in the break room, and he made certain his daily routine gave no one a reason to look closer. Most nights that worked exactly as planned, but discipline like his had a way of showing itself in small, involuntary moments, gestures too precise for an ordinary man who had simply spent his life mopping floors. A young overconfident security guard once mocked him in the lobby, calling him slow and useless in front of other staff, and Carter only nodded, absorbing the insult without a flicker of reaction, because reacting would mean someone might actually look at him. It was Grace Miller, the head of Human Resources, 58 years old and sharper than most people gave her credit for, who first noticed something did not add up about the quiet man on the night shift. She watched him repair a jammed supply closet lock one evening with brisk, practiced efficiency, his hands moving in a way that suggested far more experience than the job description required. She asked him almost casually where he had learned to fix locks so quickly, and Carter offered only a faint, deflecting smile, telling her he had simply fixed a few things in his life. Grace did not push further that night, but she filed the small detail away in her memory, the way a careful person files away anything that does not quite fit the picture in front of them, certain that sooner or later it would matter. A week before that quiet, tense night in the hallway, Evelyn Monroe had begun noticing irregularities buried inside financial reports that should have been clean, simple, and entirely routine. The numbers behind one of the company's most promising medical research projects did not align with what she remembered approving, and the more she dug, the more the discrepancies seemed to point in one specific, uncomfortable direction. Monroe Dynamics had spent years developing a healthcare initiative capable of reaching thousands of patients who desperately needed better, more affordable treatment options, a project Evelyn considered the true purpose behind everything the company did. What she found instead, hidden inside spreadsheets and shell arrangements, suggested that sensitive research data had been quietly funneled toward a rival corporation, repackaged and sold for profit rather than protected and shared as intended. The trail of evidence led, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, toward Logan Pierce, the company's 45-year-old vice president and a man Evelyn had once considered one of her most loyal allies inside the boardroom. Logan had built a reputation over the years as ambitious but dependable, someone who understood the long game of corporate strategy better than almost anyone else on her executive team. When Evelyn confronted him carefully, watching his reaction rather than simply his words, he responded with practiced calm, suggesting that perhaps she was under too much stress and seeing conspiracies where none existed. He gently, almost kindly, encouraged her to consider signing a broad restructuring agreement, one that would shift significant operational control away from her and toward a newly formed executive committee, framing it as a way to protect her from further strain. Evelyn understood immediately what such a signature would actually mean, regardless of how reasonably Logan dressed up the request, because relinquishing that kind of control would strip her of any real ability to stop whatever scheme was already quietly unfolding beneath her company's surface. She refused outright, telling him plainly that she would rather face whatever consequences came than hand away the company her own family had spent decades building from almost nothing. Logan's expression shifted then, only slightly, the warmth in his voice cooling into something colder and more deliberate as he told her she did not fully understand the kind of opposition she was choosing to provoke. It was not a threat exactly, not in any way she could repeat to a lawyer or a board member, but it left her chest tight with a dread she could not immediately name or explain to herself. Down the hallway outside that office, Carter happened to be running his cart past the open door when fragments of that exact conversation reached him, low and clipped through the gap beneath the heavy frame. He caught only pieces, a tone rather than full sentences, but years of training had taught him to read the shape of danger in a voice long before he ever understood the specific words being spoken. The calm, controlled menace beneath Logan's tone did not sound like ordinary corporate friction or the usual tension of disagreeing executives arguing over a contract. It sounded, to Carter's trained ear, distinctly like the careful, rehearsed language of a coordinated pressure campaign, the kind designed to corner someone until they had no real choice left at all, and he found himself slowing his steps without fully deciding to. Later that evening, alone in her office with the city lights spread out beneath her window, Evelyn allowed herself a rare moment of honesty about how frightened the entire situation actually made her feel. She had built her career on confidence, on never once allowing a room full of powerful men to see uncertainty cross her face, and that habit had served her well for years until tonight. Now she sat staring at numbers that proved her own company had been quietly turned against the very patients it claimed to serve, and the betrayal felt personal in a way no business setback ever had before. She thought briefly of calling her father, the founder whose name still hung in brass letters above the lobby, before remembering that he was gone now and the decision, like every decision lately, rested entirely on her own shoulders. 2 nights later, Carter noticed something in the parking garage beneath the tower that immediately set off every quiet alarm left over from his old life. A basement security camera he passed every shift sat tilted at an unnatural angle, aimed at a blank concrete wall, instead of the entrance it was meant to monitor, and a technical access door nearby stood propped open by a folded piece of cardboard. Neither detail would have meant much to an ordinary employee hurrying toward the exit, but to Carter they read like a single clear sentence written in a language only he still understood. Later that same evening, a small group of men in dark, plain clothing moved through the garage without pausing at the security desk, walking with the unhurried confidence of people who had already memorized every camera blind spot in the building. Carter mentioned what he had seen to the night security supervisor, choosing his words carefully and keeping his tone calm and unremarkable, the way he always tried to sound when speaking to anyone in the building. The supervisor barely looked up from his phone, waving off the warning with a tired laugh, telling Carter that worrying about security was not exactly part of a janitor's job description. Carter did not argue because arguing would only draw more attention than he wanted, and instead he simply filed the information away, the same way he had once filed away terrain details before a mission briefing. Upstairs, unaware of any of it, Evelyn received an unsigned message on her private line late that night, instructing her to remain in the building for an urgent, unscheduled meeting on the 42nd floor. The message offered no explanation beyond the words emergency and confidential, phrasing clearly designed to sound official enough that she would not immediately question it. Evelyn hesitated only briefly before agreeing, partly out of professional habit and partly because some instinct she could not quite name told her that ignoring it might be worse than attending. Down in the stairwell that connected the lower floors to the executive level, Carter pulled up a worn paper diagram of the building's layout that he kept folded inside his jacket pocket for no reason he had ever admitted to himself. He studied the structure of the 42nd floor with quiet, deliberate focus, noting that if the main power failed at the right moment, that single floor could become completely sealed off from the rest of the building within seconds. He told himself, almost convincingly, that none of this was his problem anymore, that he had left behind the version of himself who ran toward danger instead of away from it. But as he passed near an open stairwell door later that night, he caught Logan's voice again, low and urgent, speaking to someone on the phone in a tone stripped completely of its earlier corporate politeness. "Tonight she signs, or she disappears from this company entirely," Logan said, the words landing in the empty stairwell with a weight that left no real room for misinterpretation. Carter stood frozen for a single heartbeat, feeling the old instinct rise through his chest like a current he had spent years trying to suppress, and then, quietly, he began moving toward the stairs that led up toward the 42nd floor. He moved slowly at first, telling himself with every step that he could still turn back, that there were other people whose job it was to handle situations like this, security teams and police departments and lawyers far better equipped than a man pushing a cleaning cart through empty corridors after midnight. Yet each argument he offered himself sounded thinner than the last, drowned out by a simpler, older truth he had spent years trying to outrun, that he had never once been the kind of man who could walk past someone in danger and keep walking anyway. By the time he reached the stairwell door leading toward the executive floor, his hand resting against the cold metal handle, he understood with quiet certainty that whatever waited on the other side would require the man he used to be, not the one he had been pretending to be for the better part of 2 years. Evelyn stepped into the 42nd floor conference room expecting tension, perhaps even another round of careful corporate maneuvering, but nothing in her years of running the company had prepared her for what actually waited inside. Logan stood near the head of the table alongside 2 other board members she barely recognized in the dim emergency lighting, their faces carefully blank in a way that suggested they already knew exactly what was about to happen. Without warning, the lights flickered and died completely, plunging the room into a heavy, electric darkness broken only by the faint red glow of emergency strips along the floor. The elevator panel near the entrance went dark a moment later, and when Evelyn instinctively reached for her phone, she found no signal at all, the device useless in her trembling hand. Mason Drake entered through the far door then, 42 years old and built like a man who had spent his life working in private security contracts that rarely made it into polite conversation, 3 armed men trailing silently behind him. He placed a folded document on the table in front of Evelyn without a word, sliding it across the polished surface until it stopped directly beneath her hands, and Logan finally spoke, his voice stripped of all its earlier warmth. "You are too idealistic to run a company this large," Logan told her plainly, explaining that her insistence on protecting research data over profit had cost the board patience it no longer had to spare. Evelyn kept her spine straight and her voice steady, refusing outwardly to show how quickly her heart was hammering beneath her composed exterior, though fear had already begun spreading through her chest like cold water. Mason leaned closer, his tone almost gentle in its menace, suggesting that signing the document quietly tonight would be far easier for everyone than the alternative he was fully prepared to arrange. For the first time since this entire crisis began, Evelyn felt the true weight of how isolated she truly was, trapped on a floor with no power, no signal, and no one outside who even knew she needed help. It was at that exact moment that Carter appeared in the hallway just outside the glass walls of the conference room, pushing his familiar cart with the same unhurried, unremarkable posture he always carried through these halls. Mason barked a short laugh and waved a dismissive hand toward him, telling him to keep walking unless he wanted trouble that had nothing to do with mopping floors. Logan, irritated by the interruption, ordered one of the guards to remove the janitor immediately, insisting the man was clearly irrelevant to anything happening in that room. Carter did not move quickly and he did not argue, but his eyes swept the room once, calm and unreadable, taking in the position of every man, the location of the dead camera in the corner, the heavy glass walls, and the long, solid edge of the conference table. He noted the exact number of armed men, counted the visible weapons, and registered the flickering emergency lights as both a problem and, quietly, an opportunity he understood far better than anyone else standing in that room. Nobody in that conference room yet understood that the quiet man with the cart had already finished planning exactly how this night was going to end. Evelyn, watching the exchange from across the room, felt a strange flicker of something she could not quite name when she noticed how calmly the janitor stood his ground despite Mason's obvious threat, as though the man simply did not register danger the way ordinary people did. She had no reason yet to trust him, No information that would explain why a stranger's presence suddenly felt less frightening than the armed men surrounding her, but some quiet instinct told her not to dismiss him the way Logan so clearly had. The guard nearest Carter hesitated for a moment, glancing uncertainly toward Mason for confirmation before reaching out to grab the card and shove it aside, the small, careless gesture that would prove, within seconds, to be the costliest mistake anyone in that room would make all night. Mason crossed the room in 3 quick strides and shoved Carter hard against the glass wall, the impact rattling loud enough to make Evelyn flinch from across the room. He called Carter useless, told him he was nothing more than a man with a mop who had wandered into something far above his understanding, and shoved him a second time for emphasis. Carter absorbed the impact without resistance, his expression remaining carefully blank, and in a low, even voice he asked Mason simply to let Evelyn walk out of that room unharmed. Mason laughed at that request, genuinely amused, and turned back toward Evelyn as though the janitor pressed against the wall behind him had already ceased to matter at all. That dismissal was the mistake. The moment one of the armed men stepped toward Evelyn and reached for her arm, something in Carter shifted instantly, the years of discipline and restraint collapsing into pure controlled motion. He moved before anyone in the room had time to register what was happening, sweeping the heavy mop handle low and fast across the back of the nearest man's legs, dropping him hard onto the floor. A second man spun toward the sound and met the edge of a rolling office chair. Carter shoved into his chest with brutal, calculated force, sending him sprawling backward into the dark conference table. Carter moved through the remaining space using whatever the room offered him, a length of loose cable, the broken emergency lighting fixture, the solid edge of furniture, each object becoming exactly what he needed it to be in the half-second before he needed it. Evelyn stood frozen against the far wall, watching with wide, disbelieving eyes as the quiet, invisible man from the hallway moved with a precision that looked nothing like anything she had ever witnessed outside of a film, every motion economical, deliberate, and utterly without wasted effort. Within moments, every armed man in that room lay incapacitated on the floor, disarmed and groaning but alive, Carter having chosen control over violence at every single opportunity the chaos offered him. Mason backed away slowly, his earlier confidence completely drained from his face, studying the way Carter stood now, weight-balanced, eyes scanning, hands loose and ready in a stance that belonged unmistakably to professional training rather than instinct alone. "Where did you serve?" Mason asked, his voice noticeably unsteady for the first time that night, the bravado gone entirely from his tone as understanding settled over him like cold water. Carter said nothing in response, his breathing even, his gaze steady on Mason's face, refusing to give the man even that small piece of information about who he truly was or where he had come from. He finally spoke only once, his voice quiet but absolutely certain, telling Logan simply that he had chosen the wrong night to corner the wrong woman in the wrong building. Logan's earlier confidence cracked visibly across his face, and somewhere beneath his fear, a far more calculating thought had already begun forming about how he might still turn this disaster back in his own favor. The room itself seemed different now, the overturned chairs and scattered papers a strange contrast to the polished, expensive furniture that had surrounded them only minutes earlier, evidence of how quickly order could collapse into chaos when the wrong people pushed too far. Evelyn became aware, almost distantly, of her own ragged breathing, of the way her hands had finally stopped trembling now that the immediate danger in the room had been neutralized so thoroughly and so quickly. She studied Carter's face in the dim emergency light, searching for some trace of triumph or satisfaction, and found instead only a tired, guarded calm, as though violence had never once been something he enjoyed, only something he understood with painful clarity when it became unavoidable. Logan straightened slowly, smoothing his jacket with shaking hands, and forced his voice back into something resembling its usual cool, persuasive register, refusing to accept defeat quite so easily. He turned toward Evelyn and told her, with deliberate calm, that he had taken the liberty of investigating her newest employee weeks earlier, long before tonight's events had ever unfolded. According to what Logan claimed to have found, Carter had left military service under circumstances far less honorable than anyone in that room currently believed, framing his exit as the quiet disgrace of a man who had failed the people counting on him. He suggested, watching Evelyn's face carefully for any flicker of doubt, that she consider exactly what kind of unstable, unpredictable man she had allowed so close to her company and her own personal safety. Carter's expression did not change outwardly, but something old and painful moved behind his eyes at the mention of that night, the memory rising unbidden, the way it always did whenever someone tried to use it against him. Evelyn glanced toward him, searching his face for some reaction, some confirmation or denial, but what she found instead was a man who could clearly have walked away from this entire situation the moment it began and had chosen, again and again, not to. He still stood positioned protectively between her and the men scattered across the floor, his stance unchanged despite every word Logan had just thrown at him like an accusation meant to wound. Mason, recovering some of his nerve in the tense pause that followed, used the distraction to slip toward a small side panel near the wall, his fingers moving quickly across a hidden control pad. Across the building, deep in the server room 2 floors below, indicator lights began flashing an urgent warning as a secondary plan Mason had prepared in advance quietly activated, designed to erase the very financial records Evelyn needed to prove any of tonight's events had happened at all. A faint, acrid smell of smoke began drifting up through the ventilation system moments later, evidence that the same plan included setting a small, deliberate fire intended to destroy whatever data survived the digital wipe. Carter understood immediately that he now faced an impossible choice, torn between restraining Logan and Mason permanently right there in that room, or racing downstairs to save the only proof that could ever expose the truth behind tonight. He chose the evidence, because evidence would outlast any single confrontation, and because protecting the truth was the only way Evelyn would ever truly be safe once this night ended. He moved toward Evelyn instead of toward Logan, taking her gently but firmly by the arm and pulling her toward the stairwell door, ignoring Logan's protests rising sharply behind them as they moved. In that single decision made in less than a second beneath the weight of an old accusation he could have spent precious time denying, Carter proved far more about his true character than any explanation ever could have managed. He was not running from his past anymore, not hiding from it the way he had for years inside this very building, but finally choosing, deliberately and completely, to step back into the kind of man he had once been for someone who genuinely needed him. As they reached the stairwell door, Evelyn caught one last glimpse of Logan's face twisting with frustration and something close to panic, the calculating mask he wore so easily in boardrooms finally slipping to reveal a man badly out of his depth. She understood in that brief moment that everything Logan had built his career on, the calm authority, the careful charm, had only ever been a performance designed to mask his own limitations whenever real pressure arrived. Carter pulled the heavy stairwell door shut behind them with a metallic clang that echoed down the empty concrete shaft, sealing off the chaos above for at least a few precious minutes while they raced toward whatever waited below. Carter led Evelyn quickly through the dark emergency stairwell, thin streams of smoke already curling beneath the doors on the lower landings as they descended past, floor after floor, in tense, hurried silence. He moved with practiced economy, checking each landing before allowing her through, choosing routes that avoided the main corridors where Mason's remaining men were almost certainly still searching for them both. Evelyn followed close behind, her breathing ragged from fear and exertion, watching the man in front of her shift seamlessly between protector and something closer to a soldier with every passing floor they cleared together. She realized somewhere around the 30th floor landing that the calm, invisible janitor she had walked past 100 times without truly seeing was, underneath everything, simply a man who carried pain, quietly, while still choosing, every single time, to protect someone else first. They reached the server room on a lower mechanical floor within minutes, the air inside humming with the low electronic whir of machines that held the only surviving proof of Logan's betrayal and the data theft beneath it. Evelyn moved immediately toward the main terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she began the careful, urgent process of copying and securing the financial records before Mason's digital wipe could finish erasing them completely. She needed several uninterrupted minutes, an amount of time that suddenly felt impossibly long given the smoke already drifting faintly through the vents above their heads. Carter positioned himself directly at the narrow doorway, blocking the only entrance into the room, his body settling into the same balanced, ready stance Mason had recognized with such dread earlier that night. Mason arrived moments later, alone now, his remaining men either disabled upstairs or scattered elsewhere in the chaos. His expression a mixture of fury and something close to desperation as he realized exactly how badly tonight had collapsed around him. The corridor outside the server room was narrow, cramped, and unforgiving, exactly the kind of confined space Carter had spent years training to control, and the fight that followed was brutal, exhausting, and entirely without theatrics. Mason fought with real skill, clearly more dangerous than his earlier bravado had suggested, landing solid blows that left Carter's ribs aching and a thin line of blood tracing down from his lip. Carter absorbed the punishment without complaint, relying on patience and precise timing rather than raw strength, slowly wearing Mason down through sheer grinding control of the limited space between them. Carter finally ended the confrontation by driving Mason hard into the metal doorframe, pinning him there until the larger man's resistance finally gave out completely and his body went still against the wall. Bruised and breathing hard, Carter quietly checked that Mason remained unconscious but breathing, then turned back toward the terminal where Evelyn was still working, refusing to let even a flicker of his own pain show on his face. She glanced up at him only once, taking in the blood at his mouth and the careful, controlled way he was favoring one side of his ribs, and somehow that single glance told her more about him than any file or background check ever could have revealed. By the time emergency power flickered back to life across the building, police officers and firefighters had already begun moving through the lobby, responding to the small fire that had been quickly contained before it could spread beyond the mechanical floor. Logan, recovering some of his composure once authorities arrived, immediately attempted to twist the entire narrative, claiming loudly that an unstable janitor had attacked company staff and caused the chaos that left several men injured throughout the building. For a tense moment, it seemed possible that his version of events might actually take hold, given how little anyone outside that conference room had personally witnessed. Grace Miller arrived then, moving briskly through the gathering crowd with a small backup drive clutched tightly in her hand, explaining to the nearest officer that a secondary security recording system, one Carter had quietly activated weeks earlier without telling anyone, had captured the entire confrontation from start to finish. The footage showed clearly and undeniably who had instigated the violence, who had carried weapons into that room, and who had ultimately protected an unarmed woman against armed men acting on Logan's direct orders. Around that same moment, John Walker arrived at the scene, 50 years old, broad-shouldered and unmistakably authoritative. Having been contacted urgently by mutual former colleagues the instant word reached them that Carter's old identity had surfaced during a violent incident. Walker had once commanded Carter directly during his years of military service, and he wasted no time confirming to the gathered officers exactly who Carter truly was, describing him without hesitation as one of the most capable, disciplined operators he had ever had the honor of leading. Slowly, carefully, in measured words clearly chosen to respect lines he was not permitted to cross entirely, Walker explained that the mission Logan had referenced so carelessly had not actually been a failure at all. Carter had successfully saved every hostage that night, but the operation's true nature had remained classified for reasons far beyond his control, leaving him to quietly accept public misunderstanding rather than compromise the secrecy of an ongoing covert program. He had carried that unfair burden alone for years, never once defending himself to anyone, simply because protecting that secret had always mattered more to him than protecting his own reputation. Evelyn listened to every word with an expression that shifted slowly from disbelief into something far deeper, a quiet, profound respect settling over her features as she finally understood the true weight of what Carter had silently carried through every single ordinary night on that night shift. Logan was placed under arrest within the hour, his earlier composure completely shattered, while Mason, facing the full weight of everything Grace's footage had captured, began speaking freely to investigators about the entire operation, naming names and revealing exactly how deep the conspiracy against Evelyn's company truly ran. Outside, as the first responders began clearing the lobby and reporters gathered hungrily near the entrance, Walker pulled Carter aside for a brief private word away from the noise and the flashing lights still bouncing off the glass walls of the building. He told Carter, quietly and without any trace of judgment, that hiding for years inside a uniform meant for someone else had never actually erased who he truly was, only delayed the moment when the world would eventually need that man again. Carter listened in silence, the old guilt he had carried for so long finally beginning to loosen its grip somewhere deep in his chest, replaced slowly by something closer to peace than he had felt in longer than he could easily remember. Evelyn watched the exchange from a short distance away, understanding instinctively that whatever passed between those two men belonged to a history she would never fully access, and respecting that boundary completely without needing to ask a single question. In the days that followed, Monroe Dynamics held a carefully arranged press conference, where Evelyn stood before cameras and calmly presented the recovered evidence, fully reclaiming control of the company her family had spent decades building. She spoke with the same steady composure that had defined her throughout the crisis, though everyone close to her could see something had shifted quietly beneath the surface, a new clarity in the way she carried herself afterward. Behind the scenes, away from any cameras or public attention, she sought out Carter personally, finding him in the same quiet hallway where this entire story had first begun weeks earlier. She offered him a new position, head of corporate security for the entire company, a role that would finally use his real skills openly instead of forcing him to hide them inside a uniform meant for someone else entirely. Carter hesitated, his old instinct to retreat from responsibility rising instinctively, telling her honestly that he had spent years trying to leave behind a world built on violence and constant vigilance. Evelyn met that hesitation with quiet, genuine understanding rather than pressure, telling him plainly that she did not need another fighter standing guard over her company. What she needed, she explained, was someone who understood the difference between power and protection, someone who would build a security team around safety rather than control or intimidation. Carter considered her words carefully, the way he considered most important decisions, and finally agreed, but only on the condition that any team built under his direction would exist purely to prevent danger rather than to project authority over anyone. Grace, overhearing part of that conversation from a respectful distance, offered a dry, warm joke about the company having just lost the single best janitor it had ever employed, earning a rare, genuine half-smile from Carter himself. Before stepping fully into his new role, Carter returned once more to the long, familiar hallway where he had spent so many quiet nights pushing a cart past people who never once looked at him. He paused there for a long moment, looking at the worn mop leaning against the wall exactly where he always left it, and felt something settle quietly inside his chest, a sense that the years of running from his own past had finally, truly come to an end. He thought briefly of the small, worn photograph still folded inside his wallet, the quiet reminder that had carried him through every difficult night in this building, and understood now that protecting that life no longer required hiding from the rest of himself. Outside the wide glass windows facing east, the first pale light of morning had begun spreading slowly across the skyline, painting the tower in soft gold rather than the cold artificial light it usually wore at night. Evelyn joined him there without a word, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, both of them watching the sunrise in comfortable, unhurried silence rather than rushing toward anything neither of them was ready to name yet. The building around them had already begun stirring back to its ordinary rhythm, early staff trickling through the lobby below, unaware of how close everything had come to falling apart only days earlier. There was no promise of romance spoken aloud between them in that quiet moment, only the steady, growing sense of trust two people build slowly after surviving something neither of them will ever fully forget, and the unmistakable feeling that whatever came next, they would face it honestly, together, and without hiding who they truly were. If the story of Carter and Evelyn reminded you that real heroes often hide inside the most ordinary jobs, share your thoughts below and stay close for the next story.